Hey, it's George, and welcome to the Call to Adventure podcast. We're on a mission to help create happier people and a healthier planet. So let's get after it. Hello. Welcome to another episode of the Call to Adventure podcast with me, George Beasley, the founder of Call to Adventure. We've just added a few more trips for you guys to join us on, one of which I'm super excited to go on, is K2 Base Camp Trek in June 2021. It's 22 days in total through the Karakoram in Pakistan. And whilst Nepal has become a really popular destination for trekking and mountaineering in the Himalaya, and rightly so, I love that place, it's amazing, Pakistan has remained largely untouched, and I think that's part of what makes this one so special. It's led by Rolf, a world-class mountaineer with 30 years experience of climbing and mountaineering. We've actually had him on the show, so look out for that one for some truly crazy stories. All international travel is carbon offset and funds the 1% for the Planet mission. Coronavirus has obviously turned things upside down, so you've got the option to move your deposit to a different trip, and all bookings are fully financially insured, so your money's safe, not going anywhere. There's also no extra cost payment plan. There's a link for that on the page. If you want to book on or have a look at any of the other adventures, head over to calltoadventure.uk. But now on to today's guest. Back in 2018, Barney took on an immense challenge, becoming the first person to ski to the South Pole powered by renewable energy, traversing 1,000 kilometers over 65 days. He survived using NASA-designed solar ice melters, lithium batteries, and biofuel made from waste. The incredible journey marked the launch of the Climate Force Challenge, a mission to clean up 360 million tons of CO2 by the year 2025. In this episode, we talk about growing up off-grid in rural Australia and the impact that had on Barney's appreciation for the comforts of modern life, the realities of spending 2 months dragging a sled to the South Pole, facing minus 40 degrees, frostbite, wind and sunburn on a daily basis, Barney's non-profit Climate Force, its mission and the importance of framing climate change as an opportunity, and what companies and we as individuals can do to make a difference. Enjoy today's episode of the Call to Adventure podcast with Barney Swan. It's been quite unbelievable to see how things have escalated out in the States, and necessarily so, but the reaction from Trump has been, whilst I don't want to make it just all about railing against Trump, not what you'd expect from like a first world democracy. It's very much like kind of old Eastern European or autocratic rule, kind of quashing any civil dissent, even though it's clear that something needs to change. So it's pretty scary out there, I think. So, because you used to live in California, right?
I've been there for 7 years, so base camp has been out there, but I know Silicon Valley and Chicago and Dallas and Los Angeles, San Francisco very well, and got a lot of friends and colleagues out there who are struggling, and right of press and right of opinion, and seeing these reporters from Australia and all over just being attacked, not by protesters but by people in riot gear. It's quite concerning. I saw one of this gentleman, Australian reporter, who was put to the ground and he was submitting and he just got pepper sprayed right in the face, and he was lying down saying he was press and he got pepper sprayed. And that's just, for me, something straight out of North Korea or backwards Russia or something. That's not what America should be producing right now. And but yeah, at the same time, like I said, just keeping that relevance and that good news going is really important, but a challenge right now, because I think our generation, that mid-20s to, mid-40s is one thing, that demographic. But, imagine being a 14-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 70-year-old or an 80-year-old, those far spectrums of our society right now, I think, are feeling it more than us in a sense, because the young people are concerned that this is what they're inheriting, and the old people are frustrated that they've worked their teeth off and it all just seems to be crumbling beneath their feet, and they're having to change rapidly and wear masks and do all of this stuff. And I really want to help both of those kind of far young and the far old feel valid and up to date and feel like their opinions are heard right now, because I think a lot of them just feel like they're getting left behind, which is not a nice feeling.
Yeah, it must be very strange. I was just thinking it when you said that, being very young then. If you're kind of 13 or 14, just old enough to know like the severity of what's going on from coronavirus and then the riots. If you were a kid in America, you must just be thinking that we live in this world of anarchy. It's a very strange time to be maturing now, very different to when we were growing up, I think, in terms of stability.
Well, and just access, I think over information is needs to be managed. I've been struggling this past few days since the riots and everything have been hitting back into gear. Just reading the news all the time, and you're about to get stuck into a good 4-hour work session, and then you end up getting sidetracked, and 30 minutes of it's reading articles about stuff that you can't control, and then you just feel negative about it. And I think having ways that we can make the story of engaging in sustainable development and engaging in equal discourse between cultures and ideologies and religions and skin color and all of these things need to be of utmost importance, and just keeping it positive, because even though it bleeds, it leads sells. Fundamentally, no one's sustainably inspired through negativity and fear. And that's what we need to be shifting this towards, and I really enjoy seeing the peaceful protests and people taking a knee and getting cops and military to take a knee too. And that's beautiful. But at the other end of it, seeing these people looting and stealing stuff and on the inverse of that, people being frustrated by that looting and the violence, and it just creates that vicious cycle. Fire does beget more fire, and we need to be cooling things down in one way or another. So I hope in our discussion tonight we can have a good chat about what is possible and what is hopeful, and just the power of going for a bike ride or going for a gardening session or just sharing the outdoors. I think is a beautiful equalizer right now, especially in the heart of all of this online distress. For the most part, so much of us are not connected directly to these riots and this looting and this bad behavior and uprising, but we feel like we are through the internet. Just having one foot in the soil and one hand on the keyboard is so important. We need to be informed, but we also need to be grounded right now. That's definitely been a huge focus of both my nonprofit and just how I manage my life, is to make sure that no matter how hectic, no matter how many emails or Zoom calls or meetings or consultancy gigs or whatever it may be are happening, that I structure and manage making sure that I keep connected to the outdoors, whether it's a short walk or going on a 2-month expedition to the South Pole. It's so important that we just keep people connected to the outdoors and the power of just being in that space and listening to what comes up. And just the power of being a part of that ancient process. I'm sitting right now in the oldest rainforest in the world, 100 million to 180 million years. This forest has been unchanged. And when you start talking about millions of years of evolution, it just puts things totally into perspective. Humanity as we know it, agricultural humanity has been around for 50 plus thousand years or so. And biology has been doing its things for hundreds of millions of years. And that's what we are jeopardizing through our convenience. The earth will be fine. The fundamental systems of fungi and algae and all of these bedrock organisms that make up the bigger organisms, they will continue to adapt and do their thing. But it's the fragility of nature that we are holding within our hands right now, and extinction of species that have been doing their things for hundreds of thousands of years, and just through 250 years of industrial progress and making all of the modern luxuries that we have, we're at the tipping point of that fragility and that beauty. But fundamentally, that process is ancient, and connecting people to that process, I think, is just so important right now, especially young people, just being curious about what's under rocks and what's around the river bend and how rain is formed and how the ocean currents work. All of these things that make up our planet actually work, and connecting kids to that science and that wonder. There's so many things that still are unknown about that whole workings, and the more we can connect people to that is the aim of the game, in my opinion.
There's so many powerful benefits, and ultimately it's where we belong, kind of growing up in a more natural way outside. Because you grew up in Oz, right? And I read that you were raised off the grid. So how was your upbringing, and what was it like?
Well, I was born in W1 in St. Mary's Hospital, right near Regent's Park. And so I came from London.
The accent gives you away.
Yeah, I came from London from 7 years old and moved to off-grid Australia. and got a fair good reality check from some of the locals who would often call me a little pommy, a pom, prisoner of Her Majesty. Yeah, but I think having that transfer from living in Putney and going to primary school in London for a little bit, and then to suddenly be dumped in Australia in the rainforest, and to go to school and not having to wear shoes, which was pretty cool. I went to Wonga Beach State School where shoes were optional, but you got a detention if you were running around without a hat on in the sun, which is quite a funny juxtaposition. And
that's so awesome.
Being able to wander and to be able to go on bushwalks and to go down to the beach and to be held accountable to my actions as a young person. You know, I didn't have a phone, or there was no reception up here anyway. And to be held accountable at a young age, that if I fall off this cliff now, I'm not going to be in a good state. If I get lost in this rainforest, I'm going to have to sleep out here, which I had to do more than once through getting lost. And I think just that accountability for our actions and our security and our repercussions for our actions, I think is what being raised off grid in the middle of nowhere really taught me, you know? And I think so many people have the safety net of Google and being able to call anyone to get them out of a situation, or to have Google Maps to guide you home, or whatever it may be. The internet and being raised with the internet is obviously important, and to be digitally literate and to be able to navigate that space. But I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity just to be free and to be accountable for that freedom. I think a lot of people right now need to be more accountable to not only how they're approaching the outdoors, and a lot more people are getting lost these days hiking and whatnot because they don't know actually how to navigate once the Google Maps shuts off. But I think just that accountability for your actions has really got drilled in at a young age. And, more and more as I'm jumping into my nonprofit and consulting and mentoring and managing expeditions, just reminding people of the source of both their consumption, but also their actions. If you are going mountaineering, you're going into a bear's den. You better be responsible for if a blizzard hits up, or if whiteout conditions come, or if someone gets injured or you break a leg. I think we've really got to teach people, and not just young people, but everyone, that process of accountability that does come from having extended time in nature, whether it's a camping trip or a multi-month expedition. It doesn't matter. You need to be accountable for your actions, your preparation, and your life, and the lives of others that you're sharing that with. And from a young age, that really got drilled in. And just respecting energy, being raised off grid, I couldn't just have aircon blaring and the fans on all night. We had to be really smart with energy. And I think that was also a very humbling perspective. So many people are still, they don't have clean cooking stoves. They don't just have a nice Aga that's constantly brewing and they can go just make a cup of tea when they want. They are having to burn wood and to unclean kerosene or whatever it may be. I think just being connected to alternative ways of living that do question our convenience has been very beneficial, being raised, and being the bedrock for me to do what I'm doing right now.
It really reminds me of that Thoreau quote, "I went to the woods to live deliberately." And I thought about that a lot when I've spent a lot of time in nature, that exactly to your point, when you live in the convenient Western life where you have a lot of safety nets, nothing's probably going to go that wrong. You can always take the next bus, and if you get hungry, if you forget some food, you just go to the shop and it's no big deal. Whereas when you're out there on expedition, or even just a few days out in the sticks, then it makes what you do matter, which is what I think part of the appeal is. Exactly like you said, it gives you that real appreciation for the accountability of your actions. And I think that's it brings you into life, brings you into the moment, because it really matters what decisions you make. And I notice it a lot when we travel somewhere to a more remote place and you see the kids, and they seem a lot more mature because they've lived a life like that, not being coddie-modeled by their parents and spending a lot of time out with dangerous animals and real threats around them. So they often seem much older than their years than Western counterparts, which sometimes it's because they've had to get jobs early in their life and they've missed their childhood, which is a bit of a shame. But I think it definitely comes with a huge benefit to making you feel much more alive in their everyday, and like really engaged with your surroundings and what you're doing. So I get the sense that I lived in Oz for a little while, just for 6 or 7 months, and there seemed to be a greater connection, like you're saying, with often not wearing shoes and kids spending more time outdoors, which was really nice. I love to see that. I really thought I would love to raise my kids in this way, with a much closer connection to nature.
And coming off that statement, I think food needs to be talked about more, and that connection, as you said, if you're out in the sticks for a couple of days, you realize that you only have this much food, and you better pack your snacks, and you better pack your lunch, and you better be organized. And I think connecting people with where their food comes from is so important. Being back in Australia for this last 2.5 months, where there's quite a lot of farms, and we've got 15 acres and grow, dragon fruit and grapefruit and cucumbers and peppers and tomatoes and mint and mangosteens and starfruit, and just connecting people with how long and how precious the process of making food is, and not to waste what has taken literally in some cases years to make, to get onto your plate, and then for you just to not eat it all, or to throw it away, or to just not respect the process that got that food in front of you, I think really is important to connect people with, because we eat 3 times a day. If you're lucky, you eat 3 times a day. And through that process of choosing more vegetarian options, sourcing locally, connecting with the consequence of not getting food that's responsibly sourced, and using palm oil and using factory beef and all of these negative sides of food, I think really allowing people to understand where their food comes from is a nice bridge between the outdoors and everyday convenience, because some people really, they don't even understand where chicken comes from. Some kids, they just view it as a packaged thing and that's it. But if they actually got to see a chicken's head being chopped off and the feathers being plucked, or hearing a pig scream as it's getting slaughtered, or anything like that, which I did as a kid. We have a lot of feral pigs up here, and I remember being 8, 9 years, 10 years old and seeing a pig get slaughtered and its guts hanging out and being skinned and the whole thing. And that completely changed how I viewed meat as a young age. And I'm not saying we need to truck, boatloads of kids off to abattoirs for a school outing. But, I think at least connecting them to farms and connecting them to seeing a goat and seeing where their lamb comes from, and seeing that pigs actually do have feelings and they're very smart, and cows are very sweet, tender animals when they're being raised on pastures, and they'll come lick your face if they're friendly enough. And even just connecting them with an apple, an apple tree. You can't just plant an apple tree and expect apples to be coming out of it in a couple of months. It takes years to create an apple tree. And it takes years, a lot of energy to get bananas from around the world into English shopping centers. I think just really respecting that process of how we feed ourselves is so important. And I'm not saying we all need to become vegan and vegetarian tomorrow by any means, but we need to respect that process more, I believe. And actually making it tangible is a really big part of that.
I'd really like to dig into that, but first, let's just go deep into the South Pole Energy Challenge. So you mentioned a little bit kind of like growing up outside, off-grid. What was your journey into adventure? Did you do kind of little expeditions first? Had you done some stuff like that before you decided to do a world first in one of the toughest environments in the world?
Yeah, I've always been pushing it in the outdoors, when I left high school in Australia, I went and trekked through Patagonia for 2 months, including a 10-day trek where we had to carry our own food. And sure enough, we did run out of food. It always comes back to food. And did a lot of mountaineering and some great kayaking, sailed across the South Atlantic, did some work up in Svalbard. And yeah, definitely got my grips together in managing expedition life and managing people on expeditions as well, before embarking on that 2-month expedition. Yeah, did a lot of training, endurance training, dragging tires up hills with ski poles, which really replicates dragging a 100-kilo sled for 2 months, climbing up a mountain with rocks or water in your backpack, and then letting the rocks out, putting the rocks out the top of the mountain, or pouring out the water so you don't blow out your kneecaps on the way down is also a great way to train. Yeah, that expedition, really, I just wanted to be a part of respecting my dad's legacy. He's the first person in history to ski to both the North and the South Poles in the 80s on really hardy expeditions. He didn't have a radio or any safety net in the South Pole journey, and had to spend 8 months in a cabin down in Antarctica before embarking on that, because there was no logistics back in the day. And we wanted to do an expedition that just was relevant to where we're at, and to see if we could power ourselves off renewable energy, which was never a feat never attempted before. And 2 years of planning and logistics and getting the technology ready, working with NASA Ames in San Francisco and biofuel company that was making waste into biofuel, and lithium batteries that were powered off solar, and these vacuum flasks that melted snow into slushy water as we skied. That whole energy system combined. We started trekking at the end of 2017, and 1,000 kilometers. And 2 months later, I can finish that journey, and was a really poignant moment to start that with my father, Robert Swan. And halfway, he was having trouble with his hip and was slowing down, and really we wouldn't have been able to complete the expedition on that time frame. And so he had to pull out halfway, and I completed that journey, and was a good sort of baton passing moment, frightfully British affair of sort of big hugs and sort of carry on old boy sort of work at the bottom of the wall. And it felt good to take that responsibility and all of the sponsorship and all of the stress of storytelling and finish that journey. And very humbling experience being down in a tent for 2 months in -40 conditions, and having to manage technology that had never been used before, and biofuel that was clogging up burners a little bit because it was a bit thicker than the usual white gas, and having frostbite on my feet. Almost lost my little toe on my right foot, which wasn't too fun, and having bad chafe and my face going black underneath my goggles from frostbite, and not being able to feel my hands, and not showering for 2 months, which was slightly excessive even for an Englishman. And just being humbled fully. And like I was yapping on before, coming back to food, not having any fresh vegetables for 2 months was exceptionally challenging. I love fresh veg and fresh fruit, and just having freeze dried food and lots of nuts and bars and sugar really was hard to not have that fresh food. And first thing I did when I got back to South America, Patagonia, was dig into some fresh capsicums, some fresh peppers, some fresh tomatoes, some fresh apples, and just gorged on yummy fresh produce. So definitely was a remarkable journey, and saw some amazing things down there, like parhelion formations, ice crystals in the air, and kind of losing my brain a little bit on some days, hearing things that weren't there, and kind of going in some pretty strange meditation states. And just generally reminding myself of what freedom really is. I think we in the West are just so bloody lucky with freedom, and we sometimes forget what it's like to live a life without freedom, and whether you're in extreme poverty or a refugee, or living in a really challenging home life situation, whether it's an abusive spouse or mentally disabled people or whatever it may be. We are bound and sometimes constricted to so many things in our life, and to have freedom of mobility and of thought and of decision is a modern luxury that we should never take granted. And 45 days into that 60-day expedition, I was looking down at my black feet and having a very tough time, and part of me really wanted to quit and to go home, but I reminded myself of that freedom and of that responsibility to finish off what I said I was going to do. And I did have a safety net. I could abandon ship, and there's so many people going through much harder situations than having a bit of frostbite and not smelling so good than I was. And I felt like I had a bigger responsibility to do credit for those people who don't have a voice and don't have options, and definitely really connected to me to, just what it would be like to, be in a part of a situation like that is truly more hostile than Antarctica.
There's a really nice film documented of you guys doing the challenge, and the story of you and your dad doing it together, and it's paints a really good picture. But for people that haven't seen that, can you paint a picture of the everyday? So you've got 2 months in this incredibly hostile environment, a long way to go, and there's a reason why very few people have done it. So what does your day-to-day look like when you're out on the ice?
So you would wake up at 7 a.m., maybe a little bit before. You would put on the biofuel stove, and there'd be some water left over from the night before. Hopefully that wouldn't be frozen, but if so, you'd put a bit of thermos water and warm that water up, put the stove on, or go and get some warm water out of the ice melter that would be outside on the sled, and make sure to drink lots in the morning, because you'd wake up often really dehydrated with a headache because you were sleeping in sunlight. It is 24-hour daylight in Antarctica, which does take some time getting used to, especially when you're getting sunburnt in an orange tent when you're sleeping. You would start your day, you'd have some brekkie, which consisted of oats for me every morning, because I'm lactose intolerant. I don't like dairy. I don't associate with dairy. So I had brekkie oats for 58 days in a row, which definitely became a bit bland after a month. And so I dig into some brekkie oats, get some tea down your neck, pack your snacks, get organized for the day, do some stretching. For me, I always try to do some stretching in the morning, because you often wake up with a pretty sore back sleeping on a glacier. You would pack up the tent, get your sleeping bag packed up, and get everything into the sled as quickly as possible, because it's the coldest time when you haven't been skiing, is to put on your jacket. And to be honest, just getting out of the sleeping bag is one of the hardest moments every morning, getting out of your nice warm den and having to get your clothes back on. And yeah, that's always a tough part of the day. And once everything's packed up, you would set your bearing, which we would do every morning on a GPS. Set your bearing somewhere between 180 and 160 degrees. And then we didn't use a GPS throughout the day. You'd just be navigating on that bearing through a compass every day. And you would start skiing at around 8:30, and you would do an hour of skiing and 10 minutes of break 7 times in a row. So it was about 7 to 8 hours of skiing a day. And during that 10-minute break, you would have a pee, you would go and get some snacks into you, do a bit of stretching, and yeah, just carry on. And you would take turns leading and navigating. For me, that was my strength. I really enjoy navigating, and it's not easy to navigate out there by any means. It's like standing on a frozen ocean in the middle of the ocean, and there's just a 360-degree horizon of ice in every direction. For about 2 weeks, we saw some mountains in the distance called Thiel's Mountains, but aside from that, we were just on a frozen ocean, 360 degrees of ice, and kilometers of ice beneath you. There's actually patches of ice in Antarctica that are 16,000 feet deep, which is kind of hard to get your head around, because it's actually deeper than the continent, if that makes sense. So the ocean level, it actually goes below kilometers because it's so heavy, the ice. So it's actually below ocean level, and the deepest patch of ice is 16,000 feet deep. And they're doing ice core samples in some of those blue ice, which are over 1 million years of carbon history. So all of those ice core samples, they can drill down and they can see that ice has been there for over 1 million years, which is pretty remarkable. And they can see exactly what the CO2 indexes are because of the amount of bubbles that are in. Within the bubbles, they can see the CO2 of that time. They can see when a volcano erupted. They can have a full cut. It's like cutting a tree in half and seeing those rings of the tree, but within ice. And the science behind that is pretty remarkable. And you'd be skiing along, and during those 8 to 9 hours, and time would really kind of get disrupted. Sometimes 30 minutes felt like 4 hours, and 10 minutes just passed so quickly, depending on your headset and your mindset, time really got weird down there. And I kind of felt like I was a sundial walking sometimes, especially when you were in the front. You would just have your shadow in front of you. In 9 hours of skiing, it would start on your front right rather, and end on your front left. You just became a sundial walking in ethereal nothingness. And I really connected to the sky during the skiing, also with the ice, obviously not much to connect with aside from those two and your breath. But I really connected with just the sky down there. We started at 200 feet and skied our way up to 10,500 feet, which is the South Pole. And as we slowly rose up that glacier and the waves of ice going up and down, because it's not flat Antarctica, it's like a frozen river. You'd go down 100 feet and then up 300 feet, huge wave in ice, and then down another 50 feet and then up 200 feet. And it was always up and down, which, seeing a huge wave of ice in the distance was always a bit looming. The bigger it was, the more climbing you knew that you had ahead. But aside from that wonder of seeing the ice and seeing crevasses and the Strugi forms and the ice, just connecting with that space above was remarkable. Obviously, we never saw stars because it was 24-hour daylight, but if there is a God, which, we all have our versions of spirituality and faith and all of that, I felt that ethereal goings on above in that voided blue sky. It was just so deep and so clean and so profoundly just deep. It was almost like looking at a Milky Way, looking at the stars without the stars, because you just know that the cosmos is behind that blue and it's teeming. And the sky was just a very profound teacher down there. And I definitely felt a lot of connection with that. And and then once we would finish skiing for the day, you'd pack your tent up, always aligning the tent with the wind to make sure that you didn't get side wind and your tent would blow down if it's 40 knot wind. If you felt active, you'd dig a little pee and poo hole, so you'd have a bit of defense if you needed to go number twos at any point. It's not super fun going number two in minus 40, and so having a bit of protection from the wind is always preferred. And we would set up the camp, do some stretching again for me, which is always an important part of the routine, have some food, do some communication, have some yarns, and try and get to sleep as quickly as possible because you were always tired and always hungry. And I also found time for journaling and writing some reflections and thoughts and conundrums and all of that during the evenings. And I think that just getting into that sleeping bag was just what you would think about. If it was cold and you're having a hard time, you just know that you're going to be in that sleeping bag at some point towards the end of the day. That's just the favorite part of the day, tucking up into that and feeling like a cozy caterpillar cocoon kind of thing, and just being able to just be warm, and which was nice. But towards the end of the expedition, my feet were frostbitten, so the warmth actually meant that my feet were turning back on, which felt like razors. And so sometimes the sleep would be interrupted because I'd go into the sleeping bag and my feet would be dead numb, couldn't feel them, and then 4 hours later they would start to warm back up, and it felt like lots of little needles getting jabbed into my toes. So that wasn't too fun to deal with before the end, and definitely disrupted my sleep. But the sleeping bag is heaven.
How did completing the adventure change you as a person?
I think it just showed me that I'm tough and I'm resilient, and I'm a pretty lean guy. I've always had a bit of I wouldn't say body shame issues by any means, but I've always kind of thought of myself as a bit too skinny growing up, and seeing all of these macho men in magazines with their massive arms and their huge chests and their abs, and kind of sometimes feeling that I didn't have that body and I felt inadequate in a sense. It kind of helped me break free of that in a way, and realizing, I may be lean, I may be 72 kilos, but I can still ski 2 months to the South Pole. I can still run hard. I can still dive deep, climb hard, and I should just be proud of my body and what it's capable of. It really kind of equalized that, and not in an ego way by any means, not being like, oh, I'm bloody macho man, but just realizing that I should be respectful and I should love the body that I've been given, and just work with that instead of constantly chasing this kind of, I don't know, some sort of Greek macho man painted out of bloody marble or whatever it is. I think for me it really reinforced just that power of my body, and just from a professional sense, it's given me credibility to be talking about sustainable development and expeditions and connecting young people to the outdoors, because you can be stupid enough to ski 2 months with solar panels latched to your back. I think it gives you a bit of kudos. But it was actually a tough moment, George, coming to your goal, the South Pole, and looking at yourself in your goal, because the South Pole is actually a reflective sphere. To ski up to that after 2 months of skiing, 2 years of preparation, and then to look at yourself and be like, alrighty then. It's like kind of getting your PhD or getting married or having your first kid. You get to that point and you're like, great, so what's next? And it was one of the biggest anticlimax moments of my life, actually. The journey was powerful and so many lessons, but actually standing at the South Pole, I just didn't know what to do. I was just like, okay, so this is done. And it's actually taken me quite a while to be proud of that moment and not to be constantly seeking what's next, but to be grateful and proud of what has happened. And standing at that pole was a huge tester for that moment. I think we need to be celebrating who we are and what we've done, and obviously being relentless and having that ambition to do more and to help more and be of more of service, but also just to be proud of who we are right now. And I think from working from that space, we can be better leaders and be working stronger and being more relevant, because if we don't feel, not necessarily being proud in a gloated sense, but just being steady with who we are right now, I think is important. And definitely was a huge reminder standing at that goal of the South Pole. And then just to come back and to launch back into humanity. And I went straight from South Pole to London and had school talks within the first couple of days of being back, and promptly got dispatched to Davos, the World Economic Forum, and was talking out there with slippers on and a suit because I couldn't fit my feet into normal shoes because of the frostbite. So felt like a bit of a kook token explorer walking around Davos in slippers, and kind of really wanted to be relevant, but felt like Davos wasn't being relevant to the everyday person. So I was excited to embark on my own nonprofit Climate Force and to be making solutions and ESG and sustainable development goals and all of these things a little bit more relevant to the everyday people, everyday businesses, and just the individual humans who make up corporations, kind of humanizing that whole corporate approach. And I think COVID has really humanized corporations as well, realize that their quarterly reports are great, and having thousands of employees is great, but if they're not happy, if they get sick, if they can't come to work, that affects everything. And I think the South Pole humanized my approach to managing my nonprofit. And a final reflection there, George, is that I really had a hard time coming back into technology. 2 months doesn't seem like a long time not to be connected to the internet, but if you're hustling and moving quickly, it is. And then to suddenly come back to thousands of emails and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and YouTube and news and just this barrage of information after 2 months of being totally disconnected to that really disenfranchised me. It turned me off the whole thing and made me feel like it was all agenda seeking and very ego driven. But I'm coming around realizing that if you do it, approach it right, technology can be a huge catalyst to sharing positive stories, as we are right now, and generally exposing people to different perspectives and breaking them out of their kind of silos, and just helping people instead of just being about pretty photos and pretty people and pretty places. We need to be talking about the hard issues and being vulnerable and designing a future that we're proud of.
So let's dig into your nonprofit Climate Force. So you mentioned a little bit about it there, but what's the mission and what are you working towards?
So my mission, George, is to reduce 360 million tons of CO2 before 2025. I'm trying to gather as many models as I can from the corporate sphere, education sphere, just lifestyle, communities, and just accelerating both environmental social governance strategies, bridging businesses and investors, but also just helping ground level grassroots projects have a voice, and really just accelerating as much as I can, as quickly as I can, that align with the Paris Agreement, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, just to being human, and trying to really create a inclusive platform that people can share ideas and be a part of just some good news. Fundamentally, it comes back to that good news and good models. The more models that we have that are replicable, the better. People need to have things that are relevant to construction and dentists and consultancy companies and airports and brewery companies and tattoo shops. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. Being sustainable and realizing that we are dealing with finite resources and that we do need to create circular economies, and we do need to be using the waste that we have and cleaning up the impact that we do create through flying around everywhere and using data from data centers and doing business. It does come at a cost, and we can create a good story that aligns with getting more incentives and getting return on your business through doing good. So really just trying to connect that story to as many people as possible. And from a business perspective, really just trying to shift the game into especially developing markets, realizing that sustainability is not just tree hugging and people running around with flowers in their hair. It can help your business, and it can increase your revenue. It can make your shareholders and stakeholders and everyone in between far more trustworthy of what you're doing. And it's a total prerequisite. It's not an option anymore to align with these things, and you will get left behind effectively if you're not doing good for the planet and the communities that you serve.
And I think that mindset shift is the really important thing, that it's not a cost to bear to think about your impact on the environment and the planet as a company. It's instead, how can you thrive by incorporating aspects of sustainability into your business, right? It's not that you should feel like you're being punished or restricted by doing something. It's, if you want to have a sustainable business, this is the way that the world's going. We have an impending disaster unless we do something. And there's an opportunity to change your business so that you can be kind of on board and part of the solution. People will get behind you for that. So what's been the response from corporates? I guess the people that are asking you in are kind of already on board. There's obviously some companies. I mean, a great example is I used to work in finance, and you would find that some companies would not want to invest in oil companies. And that's a great example of how times are changing and where. And it's not because necessarily people even see the environmental side of it. It's the fact that people won't be using fossil fuels in a couple of 100 years, certainly, well, even in 100 years, in the same way that we do now, where sustainable energy is becoming cheaper, and the developments in lithium ion batteries and what you see people doing in terms of like Tesla with their cars and more charging stations, you can see that it's good for business to be in somewhere that's sustainable. So what do you think is the general zeitgeist for corporations out there? Do you think most of them get it now? Are you still seeing a bit of resistance, or what's been your impression?
Well, I think if you asked me that question in January, it would have been a very different answer to right now. And I think right now is all I can speak of. And I really believe that big finance, coming from finance, you'll know the importance of that. But, these funds and these accelerators and these ESG, green bond, like all of these big dogs who have the millions and the billions and the trillions who make the whole global economy tick over, they're really driving it right now. If you want to have your COVID relief budget put your way from BNP Paribas, for example, I do work with them, you need to be aligning with sustainable development goals. You need to be having ESG criteria that you're living up to, or you just don't get your funding, And right now, like I said, we're really beginning to humanize the corporate world more, and realizing that, for example, Shell done a bit of consulting work on their environmental practices, and Shell cops a whole lot of everything for being who they are and having a bit of a history and all of the stuff. But fundamentally, they still provide energy for millions every day. They are the biggest oil company in the world, and they are just as much as a part of the transition than everyone else, especially with energy and making charging stations and hydrogen, and all of these big transitions happen. And someone like that, they have 500,000 employees globally. And if you can empower each of those employees to actually trust Shell's managers and their CEO, you have a total system change. If they all become ambassadors for doing good and for actually believing in what Shell stands for, and not just sitting around because it's a good paycheck, but actually feel like they're a part of a company who do care and are transitioning and are making an effort to do better and to acknowledge, what they have or haven't done up to this point, I think right now that humanizing those 500,000 is really, really evident. And I think corporations are just, listening to what their employees are telling them, like look at just working from home. We can save so much money from people sitting on the tube for hours a day and driving for hours and flying around the planet for conferences that, are important, but being far more strategic with how we interact, I think, is a big shift right now, and taking responsibility for the bigger impact of going business class around the world for a 2-day conference. Or if you're a tech company and you're using thousands of gigs a minute, through streaming and mining and data related services, you have an obligation to do something about that and to offset, those tons of CO2 that come from heavy data related services. And I really do believe that big finance is going to be supporting those who do good and who align with doing good from an ESG, environmental, social, governance perspective, or CSR, corporate social responsibility perspective. If you really are holding up to those criteria and you are showing that you do care and you have the data to support that, and you're not just greenwashing things to tick boxes, I really do believe we're going to see a huge acceleration in the renewable tech space, in clean eating, in more ethical animal agricultural habits, in decarbonizing hotels and transport sector, and having more bike paths. And I really do think if we can unify right now with everything that's going on, not just between COVID, but the recent tumultuation that is being caused in America and throughout the world right now with diversity, inclusion, if we are all on that same wavelength, I really do believe that we can create more jobs, we can be more economically successful, but not at the cost of the planet. And I really believe right now we just need to work on distributing the wealth, and fundamentally, whether it's Shell or a bank or pharmaceuticals or even a weapon manufacturing company or a chemical manufacturing company or whatever it may be, fertilizer company, Monsanto, whoever it may be, who sometimes get pointed at, or plastics company, if we can actually distribute their wealth and not just have 1% of the big corporates within these companies making the predominant amount of money, and we can use these big pillars of industry and reshape how they are focusing more on the environment and more on the communities that they serve. I think that that's the paradigm that we are up against right now that still needs to shift, because all of those industries I just mentioned, in itself, they're providing a service, but it's the greed and it's the kind of wanting to protect your assets and not collaborate in fear of competition doing better or whatever it may be. If we can dissolve that and realize that we are one species, and yes, we have different priorities, in China and Uganda and London and New York and India and Australia, they're all going to be doing it differently. But fundamentally, if we have that shared vision of aligning with the Sustainable Development Goals, and we can manage food security and energy security and water security, which is just going to be such a big issue in these coming decades, I really do think we can create that collaborative spirit that we've seen in COVID. Scientists are working who've never worked before together to make a vaccine happen quicker than ever before. And if we can have that collaborative spirit and see people rallying on social media like never before, I hope once this Black Lives Matter movement, finds its legs and has the impact that we all want to see from that. I'd love to see the entire world for a week just posting green on their social media and doing a project that completely blacks out the music industry and the social media, and that we all have a moment to just post green, or to have that same rallying cause, which I'm so delighted to see within the Black Lives Matter. And to be honest, to see just how the media completely, everyone was checking the media at the beginning of COVID, the end of March, early April, like everyone was on the media. And if everyone can have that same focus on caring for our planet and looking after biodiversity and the rallying and the collaboration and the noise that is being created through both what's happened in America and COVID, if we can have that same spirit and that same urgency towards doing good for our planet and protecting our shared home, I really do think we can see that systemic change that's needed, and we can be moving more from greed towards a collaborative future.
Yeah. one of the major positives of COVID is to see when there is a strong desire to change the way things are, the status quo, and where there's really a need felt and a sense of urgency, massive change can happen in such a small amount of time. I don't think that people really thought that such radical change could happen so quickly, to stop flights, to shut down industry, to even housebound people as well, which is a whole nother conversation. But it shows that when there's that will, there is just this massive action that can be taken. And then exactly like you said with Black Lives Matter, the social side and the mobilizing technology, it shows that if we get the message through, then the action that needs to be taken can be taken to meet that 2-degree target. But I think the real difficulty with climate change is the fact that it's almost the opposite of COVID. COVID is something that spreads very quickly and may affect you and people in the developed world in kind of number of weeks or months, whereas climate change is slower moving. So how do you think we can get across the urgency and the importance of climate change and the related challenges to people who don't really feel it in their day-to-day now?
Well, I think the doom and the gloom clearly hasn't worked. Al Gore teetering on ladders and, all of the kind of before the flood and these quite hardcore documentaries, I think have their place. But fundamentally, we need to be really showing good role modelship, I think, is how we shift it. If Justin Bieber and Brad Pitt and Kim Kardashian and Boris Johnson and all of these people who have the spotlight on media on them right now started becoming 90% vegetarian and offsetting their plane travel and sorting out their rubbish and doing videos about them actually making an effort to sort out their recycling and to manage their data and to be just having the conversation of respecting our planet, I think that's where we see a huge shift. And if you couple that with economic incentives, like you have that social kind of bandwagon effect of celebrities and influencers around the world accelerating this stuff between cultures and between regions. On top of that, if you show the economic benefits through saving money, making money for your business, through aligning with these things, I think it shifts the conversation from climate problem to climate opportunity. Because even if you straight anti-climate change denier and you think it's just a big hoax, what's the problem with cleaning up rubbish and making assets out of it? What's the problem in accelerating renewable energy that's cheaper and more effective for your family? What's the problem in shifting to a more plant-based diet if that saves you whatever $500 every couple of months for your family, or whatever it may be? If you really outline the economic incentives and benefits for getting along this path and that social kind of clause of you will be seen as cool or sexy or relevant or just a part of that bandwagon, which everyone does like to be a part of, I think those two things are going to be a bigger driver in regards to just spreading the actual action rather than the urgency. Because I think urgency turns off some people. If you see enough videos, which I have, of whales choked in plastics and bloody forest burning and the whole doom and gloom of our reality that we're up against, it turns people off after a while. And if you can really be positioning what they can do and that it is seen as cool and that they do have toolkits and resources and means to accelerate these things, I think that's where we're going to see the big effect. And especially, I think it's not the people who watch the documentaries. It's the people who are struggling paycheck to paycheck. It's the people who are unemployed. It's the people who are pretty pissed off at the system that we're in right now. Those are the ones that we need to be engaging on climate change and climate responsibility, because you can preach to the choir until the cats come home, but it's really disrupting and changing the idea and behavior of those who couldn't give a monkey's. That's the challenge that we're up against and the opportunity.
I think that's a fantastic way to look at it. Yeah, phrasing it as that opportunity, which it really is. So we talked a little bit about things that companies can do. You mentioned earlier carbon offsetting, and that's fairly cheap to do. We do that with all of our international travel, and there's often the opportunity to kind of two birds with one stone type thing, where you offset the carbon, but you also help local communities out of poverty. So you can really do good with a small amount of money. And then another one that you talked about was like thinking about your kind of data and energy usage. So we talked about a couple of things that corporates can do, but what are some things that can move the needle, just like a couple of suggestions for individuals if they think, yeah, I really do want to be a better global citizen from an environmental point of view? What really moves the needle?
I think diet, like we were talking about at the beginning, we all have 3 meals a day if you're lucky enough. And just sourcing and being smart about your food, I think really starts the whole process. It has, sure enough, for me, and I'm shifting to a far more vegetarian focused diet with the occasion of some fish. Being raised in Australia, they definitely like their fish out here, so I occasionally have some fish and still have some eggs, but don't have any milk products. And I think just going to farmers markets and trying to pick the produce, which is hard in England, I know, especially, to not get stuff that's wrapped in plastic, but trying to find things that aren't wrapped in plastic and just getting a loaf of bread that's been made fresh instead of buying something that's covered in plastic. These small changes, if enough people do it, you're going to see a lot more adaptation from the suppliers, and they will realize that people are leaning more towards non-plastic produce and sourcing locally. And I think that will just become more of a priority. Just look at this, just on a side note, the supply chains just being completely changed up during COVID, having cotton made here and then textiles made from it over there and then being shipped back to somewhere, that I think that world's slowly coming to a close, and being able to have things that are made locally. And I think it's just so important to support, and it's not always easy, and you might have to go to a different shop and not just go to Tesco's, or even if you do go to Tesco's, it's just the power of our wallet is just so important, and being really smart with questioning, when you're going shopping, do I really need this? Is this just going to make me briefly happier, or quality instead of quantity, or whatever it may be? Just really using our wallets effectively is just so important right now, and supporting supply chains that are more local. And from there, I think just educating yourself and really monitoring the content that you feed yourself every day. I think whether it's watching documentaries instead of a zombie apocalypse film or cat videos, it's just really important that we educate ourselves daily. And it's so easy to turn off with easy content, but feeding yourself with documentaries and TED Talks and things that really do educate yourself and open yourself up to different ideas is so important right now, because everyone has an agenda with what they're speaking about. And I believe if you are diverse in what you input yourself with, you come up with your own ideas. And read what the Republicans are saying, read what the Democrats are saying, read what the Greenies are saying. Try and find that middle ground in discourse these days, which I think is so important, instead of just believing everything that the one media source that you go to says. I think from there, just sharing the outdoors, making time, whether it's going to your local park or organizing a camping trip with friends, or coming on an expedition to Antarctica with us. It doesn't really matter. I'm not saying you need to come on an expedition or go up to Scotland for a month and be living out of sort of a sleeping bag and a bivy sack, but just sharing, going to Hyde Park with your kids, or going to a local nature reserve and connecting with wildlife projects and tree planting and community gardens and projects that are supporting rehabilitation for injured wildlife, or whatever it may be. Somehow getting outdoors and ideally connecting with volunteer work that is helping preserve both wildlife, biodiversity, and land preserves really does connect yourself. And if you can share that with young people and your loved ones, I think you see a scaled effect, especially if you do it within your businesses and schools. And so, yeah, just 3 things from the get-go there, monitoring your content, shifting your diet, and really just making more time for the outdoors, and just sitting with yourself, and occasionally putting the phone on airplane mode in the morning when you're waking up, instead of just jumping into emails and WhatsApp. Put the airplane mode on for 20 minutes, do some stretching, have some tea, just check in with yourself in the morning, and before you go to bed, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, having that digital detox when we wake up and when we go to bed, I really do believe is very important, especially right now with so much information on the news. And I think that just makes us more aware and more present within our own bodies, but also within how we're consuming and how we're taking responsibility for our day-to-day purchases and our day-to-day actions.
And I would really recommend some mindfulness or meditation, as I've talked about quite a few times. I used Headspace initially to start meditating, and I'm just redoing Sam Harris's course, Waking Up, and it's fantastic. And if you don't have enough cash to pay for it, if you're feeling on hard times in COVID, you can actually get it for free. So yeah, I'd highly recommend that. And Jacob, our environmental writer, he's put some really good suggestions in his article, how adventurers can help fight climate change. There's a good list, and he's tried to do the hard work of prioritizing what can really move the needle if people are interested in finding out a few more suggestions. Well, Barney, thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic to hear about your adventures and your work at Climate Force and just have a bit of a chat. So thank you so much for coming on.
No worries, George. My absolute pleasure, mate. And good to hear a proper English voice surrounded by all of these pesky Aussies, which are definitely not quite the Queen's language anymore. But just one more food for thought for anyone listening is that I think cleaning up rubbish is a responsibility all of us need to be getting involved in. And I think right now there's a lot of people who are quite turned off by that because it might have COVID on the wrapper that you're picking up. But if you have you can get a claw, you can get a picky up claw, which I have several of, that you can pick up anything and put it in the trash. And I don't mean that we need to be sort of walking around the streets and cleaning up trash like a mad person. But if it's in your proximity, if you're near a water source, if you're on the beach, if you're in a nature reserve, if you're in the forest and you see some plastic, you see some trash, have that responsibility to clean it up. It is our planet, and especially in the outdoors, unless there's a ranger around, no one else is going to clean that up. And I think that process of cleaning up automatically, I think has shifted my responsibility so much. And I clean up public bathrooms if it's a mess. If someone's done whatever, if there's tissues everywhere, I think just cleaning up after each other is such an important thing, because it's not someone else's responsibility to clean up our planet. It's all of our responsibilities. And if you do it smart, if you have a picky up claw, if you have some hand sanitizer on standby, for me, it's really a thing that I do all the time, especially on beaches, and it makes me feel good. You see a big patch of trash and you clean it up and then boom, it's gone. And it's a tangible legacy that you've left today, and we can all be a part of that. So I'd very much encourage, next time you go hiking, maybe pack a plastic bag so you can put some trash in it. The next time you go to the beach, even just everyone who goes to a beach picks up 5 bits of trash. It makes a difference if millions of people are doing that. So just one more thing that we can all do. And I know this is about call to adventure. This is the podcast. And I think it's a responsibility for all adventurers out there, whether we're going to a park or climbing Everest, clean up after yourself. And there's that age-old expression, leave only footprints and take only photographs. I think that's outdated. We need to be leaving only footprints and cleaning up some trash as well. So and leaving a place better than you found it, which I think is something I endorse everyone to be a part of. And put it on social media. I think the more people are seen to be cleaning up trash, the more it can be seen as cool and acceptable and not gross to be doing so. I think it's important to share that good role modelship. So just a little food for thought from far north Queensland, Australia.
Brilliant advice. And after talking with Lizzie from Plastic Patrol a couple of weeks ago, she would be imploring me to tell you to snap it as well. Snap the rubbish that you're finding, download the app for free, take a picture of it, and then they can map it out and use that for lobbying corporations and government. So Barney, thank you. If people want to find out a little bit more about you and Climate Force, where's the best place for them to check you out?
climateforce.com and barneyswan.com will both have some information. And I would encourage anyone to just check out the Sustainable Development Goals for the Paris Agreement. I think everyone should just check out that website once and just go to 17 Sustainable Development Goals and see the United Nations' best effort to create 17 modules to design a more sustainable future. So I highly recommend anyone just to go check out that. I think they're doing a great job.
Great use of time in COVID during lockdown. Good thing to do. Brush up on that. So yeah, Barney, thank you again so much for coming on the show. And listeners, thank you again for tuning in. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks. Bye-bye. So that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Head over to Call to Adventure, that's TO, calltoadventure.uk for show notes and more about this episode. You'll also find lots of other free content there. Things like how-to guides and gear reviews, everything to get you out on your next adventure. We've also got loads of adventures for you to join us on in the UK and abroad. We've got things like climbing, hiking, mountaineering, surfing, wild swimming, ski touring, and we're adding new ones all the time, so do take a peek. Each booking helps us fund our green mission, and all international trips are carbon offset. Please do rate and review the show if you're enjoying it. It helps get more people engaged with the outdoors and on board with protecting wild places. Thanks for listening. See you next time.